Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another quiet night here with us. Tonight we're settling in with a subject that has survived thousands of years of gossip, scandal, and outright chaos: the ancient Greek gods. A family so wildly dramatic that modern soap operas would look tame beside them. So before you get too comfortable, if you're new here, consider hitting subscribe. Only if you actually enjoy this sort of thing. No pressure either way. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it happens to be where you are. There's something oddly comforting about knowing people are drifting off to sleep together across so many different time zones. Now go ahead, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum quietly in the background, get yourself comfortable, and let's slip into tonight's stories together. We begin, as most of these tales do, with the king of the gods himself, Zeus, ruler of the sky, master of thunder, and a walking case study in what happens when someone is handed unlimited power and absolutely no supervision. Zeus was the youngest child of the Titan Cronus and his wife Rhea. Now Cronus had a rather alarming parenting technique. He swallowed each of his newborn children whole, convinced that one of them was destined to overthrow him one day. Charming man. Rhea, understandably tired of watching her children vanish down her husband's throat, decided enough was enough. When Zeus was born, she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and handed that to Cronus instead, who swallowed it without a second glance, which really does tell you everything you need to know about his attention span. Zeus was smuggled away and raised in secret on the island of Crete, hidden in a cave, protected by nymphs, and kept safe from a father who couldn't tell the difference between his own son and a rock. Once Zeus reached adulthood, he returned to challenge his father directly. He forced Cronus to disgorge his swallowed siblings, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Hestia, and Demeter, all of whom came back into the world fully grown, which must have made for an extremely strange family reunion. Together, the six of them waged a 10-year war against Cronus and the other Titans, a conflict the Greeks called the Titanomachy. Zeus and his siblings eventually won, banishing most of the Titans to the depths of Tartarus, and Zeus claimed the throne of the heavens for himself. As king of the gods, Zeus ruled from Mount Olympus, controlling the sky, commanding thunder and lightning, and serving, at least on paper, as the guardian of justice, order, and sacred oaths. In practice, however, Zeus spent an extraordinary amount of his divine energy transforming into animals in order to pursue various love interests, mortal and immortal alike. He became a swan to approach Leda, a bull to carry off Europa, a shower of golden light to reach Danae, and an eagle on more than one occasion. It's a strange kind of leadership style, ruling the cosmos by day and sneaking around as livestock by night. His romantic pursuits produced an enormous number of children, gods, demigods, and mortal heroes scattered across the ancient world, many of whom grew up without a father present and went on to found cities, start wars, or otherwise leave their mark on mythology entirely because of their complicated parentage. And yet, for all his flaws, Zeus wasn't purely chaotic. He was the one who upheld Xenia, the sacred Greek custom of hospitality towards strangers and travelers, and he took oath-breaking extremely seriously, often punishing mortals and gods alike for betraying their word. He was feared, respected, and worshipped across the Greek world, with the great sanctuary at Olympia built in his honor, home to the original Olympic Games. So Zeus was, in the end, a contradiction wrapped in a thunderbolt, a protector of order who couldn't quite manage to order his own personal life, a dispenser of justice who rarely applied it to himself. Now let's turn to his wife and sister Hera. Yes, sister and wife, which even by the standards of Greek mythology took some getting used to. Hera is officially the goddess of marriage, women, and family, a title that becomes almost painfully ironic once you learn the details of her own marriage. She was the daughter of Cronus and Rhea, meaning she endured the same unpleasant swallowing ordeal as her siblings before being freed when Zeus overthrew their father. According to some versions of the myth, Zeus courted her by transforming into an injured bird, and when she took pity on the creature and held it close, he changed back into himself. It's a strange beginning to a marriage that would soon become the most infamous in the entire Greek pantheon. As Queen of Olympus, Hera held enormous power and was worshipped widely, especially in cities like Argos and Samos, where grand temples were built in her honor. But her mythology is dominated overwhelmingly by one theme: her fury toward the women, and occasionally men that Zeus pursued, along with the children born from those affairs. She is rarely shown punishing Zeus directly. Instead, her anger lands on those with far less power than she has. She transformed the nymph Callisto into a bear. She cursed Echo to only ever repeat the last words spoken to her. She sent serpents to kill the infant Heracles in his crib, a child who had done nothing except exist. It's difficult mythology to read through a modern lens, a goddess whose story is so often reduced to jealousy and vengeance rather than the domains she actually ruled over. Because underneath the anger, Hera was also a protector, particularly of married women and of the sanctity of family life. She was invoked during childbirth, honored in wedding rituals, and treated as a guardian of the household in a culture where a woman's role within the family carried enormous weight. Her myths, taken as a whole, tell the story of a goddess trapped inside a marriage that constantly undermined the very thing she was supposed to represent, forced again and again to assert her dignity in the only ways left available to her. She isn't simply the jealous wife of later retellings. She's a queen holding together an institution that her own husband seemed determined to dismantle, one transformation at a time. Next we have Poseidon, Zeus's brother, god of the sea, of earthquakes, of storms, and, oddly enough, of horses. The Greeks associated him with horses because they believed he created the very first one by striking a rock with his trident, which is certainly one way to explain the existence of an animal. When the three brothers divided the universe after their victory over the Titans, Zeus took the sky, Hades took the underworld, and Poseidon was given dominion over the seas, a realm that suited his volatile, unpredictable temperament perfectly. Poseidon ruled from an underwater palace and commanded the creatures of the ocean, both the beautiful and the monstrous. Sailors prayed to him before long voyages, fishermen made offerings for safe catches, and coastal cities built temples in his honor, hoping to stay on his good side, because staying on Poseidon's bad side tended to be catastrophic. He was capable of calming the seas for those he favored and summoning devastating storms for those who displeased him. His trident wasn't merely a symbol, it was a weapon believed capable of shattering the earth itself, and Greek myths credit him with causing earthquakes whenever his temper got the better of him, which happened often. One particularly famous episode involves his rivalry with Athena over the patronage of a certain city in Attica. Poseidon offered the citizens a spring of water, which turned out to be salt water and largely useless. Athena offered them an olive tree, providing food, oil, and wood. The people chose Athena's gift, and the city was named Athens in her honor. Poseidon, characteristically, did not take the loss well, and the myth suggests he flooded parts of the region out of pure spite. It's a small story, but it captures him perfectly, a god capable of generosity and creation, but equally capable of destructive tantrums when his pride was wounded. His romantic history was just as turbulent as his brother's, involving numerous nymphs and mortal women, and producing several children who inherited his volatile nature, along with a handful of legendary monsters. Despite all of this, Poseidon remained one of the most heavily worshipped gods in the Greek world, essential to a civilization that depended entirely on the sea for trade, travel, and survival. He was protector and destroyer in equal measure, much like the ocean he ruled, capable of carrying you safely to a distant shore, or swallowing your entire fleet without warning, depending entirely on his mood that particular day. And finally, for tonight's opening chapter, we come to Hades, ruler of the underworld, a god whose reputation has been badly distorted by later storytellers eager to cast him as a villain. In truth, Hades was neither cruel nor evil. He was simply the god assigned the least glamorous job in the entire family, overseeing the realm of the dead for all eternity, while his brothers got the sky and the sea, arguably the two most impressive domains in existence. Hades ruled his kingdom with quiet, steady authority rather than the theatrical chaos so common among the other gods. He wasn't prone to public scandal, didn't chase after mortals, and rarely left his domain to interfere in the affairs of the living. His kingdom, also called Hades, contained different regions for different souls. The peaceful fields of Elysium reserved for heroes and the virtuous, the gray, uneventful plains of Asphodel for ordinary souls, and the punishing depths of Tartarus reserved for those who had committed the gravest of crimes. Managing all of it required a certain grim discipline that none of his siblings possessed. His most famous myth, of course, involves the abduction of Persephone, daughter of the harvest goddess Demeter, a story so significant it explains the origin of the seasons themselves, and one we'll return to a little later tonight in far greater detail. Despite the troubling nature of that story, Hades and Persephone are consistently depicted afterward as a stable, functioning pair, ruling the underworld together with a kind of solemn partnership rare among the Olympian marriages we've covered so far. Hades also kept Cerberus, his three-headed guard dog, stationed at the entrance to the underworld, ensuring that souls could enter but never leave, and that the living rarely dared to try crossing over uninvited. Unlike Zeus, Poseidon, or even Ares, Hades wasn't the subject of constant myths involving infidelity or explosive rage. He simply did his job silently, endlessly, without complaint, which is perhaps exactly why the ancient Greeks built so few temples in his honor. They weren't fond of him, not out of hatred, but out of a very human fear of drawing the attention of the one God who ultimately decided where every soul would spend eternity. We'll pause here for a moment before moving on to the rest of the Olympian family, Athena, Ares, Aphrodite, and the others waiting quietly in the wings of Olympus. Just breathe, settle deeper into your pillow, and know that there's still a long, gentle night of storytelling ahead of us. Let's continue now with Athena, goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and the kind of calm, calculated intelligence that made her one of the most respected figures on all of Olympus. If Zeus ruled through raw power and Poseidon through unpredictable temper, Athena ruled through pure, unshakable reasoning, and that difference mattered enormously to the ancient Greeks, who valued clever strategy over brute force in almost everything they admired. Her birth alone sets her apart from every other Olympian. According to the myth, Zeus took Medes, a titaness known for her wisdom, as one of his early lovers. When a prophecy warned him that any child born from Medes would eventually surpass him in power, Zeus did what Zeus so often did when faced with an inconvenient prophecy. He swallowed Medes whole. Sometime later, Zeus was overcome by an unbearable headache, and when the god Hephaestus, or in some versions Prometheus, split his skull open to relieve the pain, Athena emerged fully grown, fully armored, and ready for battle. It's one of the strangest origin stories in the entire mythology, and yet it fits her perfectly. A goddess who essentially skipped childhood altogether and arrived in the world already composed, already formidable, already impossible to underestimate. Unlike her half-brother Ares, who embodied the brutal, chaotic side of warfare, Athena represented its disciplined, strategic side. She was the goddess generals prayed to before a battle, not for blind courage, but for clarity of thought. She guided the hero Odysseus through years of hardship on his long journey home, helped Perseus in his quest against Medusa, a story we'll return to later tonight, and served as a mentor figure to countless heroes throughout Greek myth, always offering guidance rather than direct interference, always favoring cleverness over force. She was also the goddess of crafts and weaving, and this side of her mythology produced one of the more unsettling stories in the entire pantheon, the tale of Arachne, a mortal weaver so skilled that she dared to claim her talent rivaled the goddess herself. Athena, offended by the comparison, challenged her to a contest. According to most versions, Arachne's weaving was flawless, arguably even superior to Athena's own. But rather than accept defeat gracefully, the goddess destroyed the mortal's work in a fit of anger. Arachne, in despair, attempted to take her own life, and Athena, in a strange act of mercy, transformed her into a spider instead, condemning her to weave for the rest of her days. It's a myth that captures something important about the gods as a whole, generous and vengeful in the very same breath, capable of admiration and destruction toward the same person within moments of each other. Athena remained famously unmarried and childless throughout her mythology, choosing instead a life devoted to wisdom, strategy, and the protection of her favored cities and heroes. She became the patron goddess of Athens itself, the city that bears her name, home to the Parthenon, one of the most magnificent temples ever built in the ancient world, standing even today as a monument to her enduring legacy. Now let's move to Ares, the god of war in its rawest, bloodiest form, a figure who stood in almost direct opposition to everything Athena represented. Where Athena embodied strategy, restraint, and calculated victory, Ares embodied chaos, aggression, and the sheer brutal violence of the battlefield itself. The screaming, the confusion, the blood-soaked ground where courage and cruelty become indistinguishable from one another. Ares was the son of Zeus and Hera, and despite being born into the very heart of Olympus, he was never particularly well-liked by the rest of the gods, including his own parents. In one striking passage from ancient Greek literature, Zeus openly calls Ares the most hateful of all his children, which is a rather remarkable thing for a father to say about his own son. And yet it fits the pattern of a god whose myths rarely show him using wisdom, patience, or restraint of any kind. His reputation among mortals reflected this discomfort as well. The Greeks respected strength and courage in warfare, but they admired strategy and honor even more, and Ares consistently fell short of both. He charged into conflict without much planning, thrived in violence for its own sake, and was associated with fear and terror quite literally, since his sons by Aphrodite were named Phobos and Deimos, meaning panic and dread, deities who accompanied their father onto the battlefield and spread chaos wherever he appeared. Ares is also central to one of the more embarrassing episodes involving the gods, his affair with Aphrodite, who was married to Hephaestus at the time. When Hephaestus discovered the affair, rather than confronting the pair directly, he crafted an intricate, invisible net and trapped the two lovers together in bed, then summoned the rest of the Olympians to witness their humiliation. The other gods reportedly found the entire scene hilarious, laughing at the two of them tangled together in Hephaestus's clever trap, a public embarrassment that became one of the most retold episodes in later art and literature. Despite his poor reputation among the Greeks, Ares was still honored in times of actual warfare, when soldiers sought his favor before marching into battle, hoping he might grant them ferocity and survival, even if they didn't particularly admire him as a person. In Roman mythology, his equivalent, Mars, received a far more dignified makeover, becoming a disciplined, honorable god of war closely tied to Roman identity itself. But in the Greek imagination, Ares remained something closer to a necessary evil, powerful, dangerous, and impossible to ignore, but never quite respected the way his more composed siblings were. Now to Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and desire, whose mythology reads like an endless chain of romantic entanglements, jealousy, and consequences that rippled far beyond her own personal life. There are two competing origin stories for her birth, and the difference between them tells you a great deal about how unpredictable Greek mythology can be. In one version, she is simply the daughter of Zeus and the Titaness Dione, a fairly ordinary Olympian birthed by the standards of this family. In the older, far stranger version, she was born from the sea foam that formed after the Titan Cronus overthrew his own father Uranus in a particularly violent act and cast the remains into the ocean. From that foam, fully grown, rose Aphrodite, drifting to shore near the island of Cyprus. It remains one of the strangest and most memorable origin stories among all the gods, love itself born from an act of violence and mutilation. Aphrodite's beauty was said to be so overwhelming that it disrupted the judgment of gods and mortals alike wherever she appeared. She possessed a magical girdle, sometimes translated as a belt or sash, that made her utterly irresistible to anyone who saw her wearing it, an object other goddesses occasionally borrowed when they needed a bit of extra persuasive power of their own. Despite embodying desire itself, her own marriage was notably unhappy. She was given to Hephaestus, the skilled but overlooked god of the forge, and her heart clearly belonged elsewhere, most famously with Ares, an affair that led directly to the humiliating net incident we just covered. Aphrodite's influence extended well beyond romantic entanglements among the gods. She was central to one of the most consequential events in all of Greek mythology, the judgment of Paris. When the goddess of discord, uninvited to a wedding on Olympus, threw a golden apple inscribed with the words for the fairest into the middle of the gathering, three goddesses immediately claimed it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Zeus, wisely refusing to choose between them himself, appointed a mortal prince named Paris to decide. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera offered political power, Athena offered wisdom and skill in battle, and Aphrodite offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite's gift, and that woman turned out to be Helen, already married to a Spartan king, an outcome that directly triggered the Trojan War, one of the most famous conflicts in the entire mythological tradition. Beyond the chaos, Aphrodite also had a gentler side, presiding over weddings, blessing new lovers, and inspiring the kind of devotion later poets would spend centuries trying to capture in verse. She represents desire in its purest, most untamed form, beautiful, intoxicating, occasionally reckless, and entirely uninterested in the neat boundaries mortals and gods alike tried so hard to place around love. Now we move to Hephaestus, the god of fire, metalwork, and craftsmanship, and quite notably, the only major Olympian consistently associated with actual labor. While the rest of the gods spent their time chasing mortals, waging petty wars, or holding grudges for centuries at a time, Hephaestus spent his days in the forge, hammering, shaping, and building some of the most legendary objects in the mythological world. His origin story is unusually unkind, even by the standards of this family. In most versions, Hera, ashamed of his appearance at birth, hurled him from the top of Mount Olympus, and he fell for an entire day before crashing into the sea, left permanently lame from the impact. In another version, it's Zeus who casts him out during a family argument. Either way, Hephaestus grew up outside the comfort of Olympus, eventually developing his skills as a craftsman among the sea nymphs who rescued and raised him. His return to Olympus is one of the cleverer stories in Greek mythology. Rather than simply asking to be allowed back, Hephaestus built Hera an exquisite golden throne as a gift, one that secretly trapped her the moment she sat down. The other gods, desperate to free their queen, eventually convinced Hephaestus to return by offering him something he wanted: Aphrodite's hand in marriage, along with permanent standing among the Olympians. It's a strange kind of negotiation, but it worked, and Hephaestus took his place as the divine blacksmith of Olympus from that point forward. He forged an extraordinary number of legendary items throughout Greek mythology: Zeus's thunderbolts, Poseidon's trident, the armor worn by the hero Achilles, and countless other magical objects that appear throughout the myths. Despite his talent and his usefulness to the entire pantheon, Hephaestus was consistently treated as an outsider, mocked for his appearance, betrayed by his wife, and rarely given the respect his craftsmanship clearly deserved. Yet unlike Ares or Hera, his response to mistreatment was never explosive rage. It was quiet, clever revenge, elegant traps, humiliating snares, and carefully engineered consequences delivered with the same precision he brought to his forge. He remains, in many ways, the most relatable of the Olympians, overlooked, underappreciated, and endlessly resourceful anyway. Let's move now to Hermes, messenger of the gods and easily the fastest-talking, quickest-thinking deity in the entire pantheon. Hermes governed travelers, merchants, thieves, and communication itself, a strange combination of domains that somehow made perfect sense once you understood his personality. His myths establish his character almost immediately after birth. On the very day he was born, Hermes reportedly slipped out of his cradle, stole a herd of cattle belonging to his half-brother Apollo, invented the lyre using a hollowed-out tortoise shell, and then returned quietly to his crib as though nothing had happened. It remains one of the most impressive first days in the history of Greek mythology, and it set the tone for everything that followed. As messenger of the gods, Hermes carried word between Olympus and the mortal world, guided souls to the entrance of the underworld, and assisted numerous heroes throughout their journeys, offering tools, advice, and occasionally direct intervention when the situation called for it. He helped Perseus prepare for his quest against Medusa, assisted Odysseus in outwitting the sorceress Circe, and served as a reliable, if occasionally mischievous, ally to mortals navigating the dangerous world of the gods. He carried a winged staff known as the caduceus, wrapped with two intertwined serpents, an object often mistakenly associated with medicine in later history, though Hermes' own skill set leaned far more towards speed, persuasion, and creative dishonesty than healing. As the god of merchants and trade, he represented negotiation and clever dealing, and as the patron of thieves, he represented the less honorable side of that same cleverness, a reminder that in the ancient Greek imagination, cunning itself was neither purely good nor purely bad, simply a tool that could be used either way depending on the person wielding it. Now let's turn to Demeter, goddess of the harvest, agriculture, and the fertility of the earth itself, one of the quieter Olympians, but also one of the most quietly powerful. Demeter rarely appears in myths involving warfare or scandal. Her influence instead shows up in something far more fundamental, whether or not the crops grow, whether or not the world has enough food to survive the coming season. Her most significant myth involves her daughter Persephone, and it's a story so important to Greek culture that it essentially explains the existence of the seasons themselves, along with some of the deepest religious rituals practiced in the ancient world. One day, while Persephone was gathering flowers in a meadow, the earth split open, and Hades emerged to take her down into the underworld to become his wife. Demeter, upon discovering her daughter missing, fell into an overwhelming grief so profound that she abandoned her divine responsibilities altogether, and the earth's fertility collapsed along with her sorrow. Crops withered, animals starved, and mortals began to die from famine, threatening to unravel the very balance the gods depended on, since a starving humanity meant a humanity with nothing left to offer as sacrifice. Zeus eventually intervened, not primarily out of concern for Demeter's suffering, but because the gods themselves needed mortals alive and worshipping. A compromise was reached, one we'll explore in far greater detail a little later tonight, in which Persephone would spend part of the year in the underworld with Hades, and part of the year above ground with her mother. When Persephone returns to Demeter, the earth blooms into spring and summer. When she descends again into the underworld, Demeter's grief returns with her, and the world settles into autumn and winter. It's a myth built entirely around a mother's love and loss, one that gave the ancient Greeks an emotional, deeply human explanation for the changing of the seasons around them. Demeter was also central to the Eleusinian mysteries, one of the most important religious rites in the ancient Greek world, secretive rituals held in her honor that promised initiates a better fate in the afterlife. Very little is known about the actual content of these ceremonies, since participants were sworn to strict secrecy, but their importance to Greek religious life is impossible to overstate. Demeter represents nurture, patience, and the deep, occasionally devastating bond between parent and child, a goddess capable of feeding an entire civilization, and equally capable of starving it, depending entirely on how her heart was faring that particular season. Finally, for this portion of tonight's journey, let's turn to Dionysus, god of wine, festivity, theater, and the strange, liberating madness that comes from letting go of ordinary inhibition entirely. Dionysus represented something the other gods rarely touched directly: the loss of control, the blurred line between ecstasy and chaos, the strange freedom that comes from stepping outside the rigid structure of everyday life. His birth was as dramatic as his personality would eventually become. He was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Semele, and when Hera discovered the affair, she manipulated Semele into asking Zeus to reveal his true divine form, something no mortal could survive witnessing directly. Semele was destroyed instantly, but Zeus rescued the unborn Dionysus and sewed him into his own thigh until he was ready to be born, an origin so strange that even by the standards of this family, it stands out. Dionysus is sometimes referred to as twice born because of it. Dionysus spent much of his mythology traveling the earth, spreading the knowledge of winemaking, along with an entire culture of celebration, ritual, and theatrical performance that would eventually become central to Greek civic life. He traveled with a wild entourage of satyrs and maenads, followers whose worship of him often involved abandoning social norms entirely in favor of ecstatic, uninhibited celebration. His festivals eventually gave rise to Greek theater itself, one of his most lasting and significant contributions to the ancient world. But Dionysus also had a darker, more punishing side. Those who mocked him, denied his divinity, or refused to honor his worship faced consequences that were often theatrical in the most disturbing sense of the word. One king who banned his worship was driven into a state of madness so complete that he was torn apart by his own family, unable to recognize him as anything other than prey. Another mortal who mocked him was transformed into a dolphin. Dionysus didn't simply punish, he transformed, using his power over identity and perception to make examples of those who challenged him. And yet, alongside all of this, Dionysus was also known for a genuine compassion toward outsiders, the marginalized, and those excluded from the more rigid corners of Greek society. His worship offered comfort and belonging to people who found little of either elsewhere. Women in particular found in his rituals a rare space of freedom within an otherwise restrictive culture. Dionysus embodies duality as clearly as any god in the pantheon: joy and destruction, creativity and madness, celebration and consequence, all wrapped into a single, endlessly complicated deity who blurred more boundaries than perhaps any other figure on Olympus. Let's rest here again for just a moment. Take a slow breath in, let it out gently, and settle a little deeper into wherever you're lying tonight. We still have Artemis, Apollo, and Hestia ahead of us, along with the longer, more emotional stories of Persephone, of Cupid and Psyche, and finally of Medusa, waiting quietly for us further along in the night. Let's continue now with Artemis, goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, wild animals, and the moon, a deity who carried herself with a kind of fierce independence that set her apart from almost every other figure on Olympus. Where so many of the gods we've already discussed built their myths around romantic entanglement, scandal, or explosive rivalry, Artemis built hers around something quieter, and in its own way far more radical: the refusal to be entangled with anyone at all. Artemis was the twin sister of Apollo, both born to Zeus and the Titaness Leto, and her birth itself set the tone for the rest of her mythology. According to several versions of the story, Artemis was born first, and immediately assisted her mother through the difficult, prolonged labor of delivering her twin brother, meaning that even in her very first hours of existence, she was already acting as a protector and a steady, capable presence in a moment of crisis. It's a fitting beginning for a goddess who would spend the rest of her mythology guarding the vulnerable, particularly women and children, with a ferocity none of the other Olympians quite matched. As a young goddess, Artemis reportedly asked her father Zeus for a very specific set of gifts: eternal maidenhood, a bow and arrows of her own, a group of nymph companions who would share her devotion to the wilderness, and freedom from the expectations of marriage that shaped the lives of so many other goddesses and mortal women alike. Zeus granted her request, and Artemis spent her mythology roaming forests and mountains, hunting alongside her band of followers, entirely uninterested in the romantic pursuits that consumed so much of Olympus's attention. She was fiercely protective of her independence, and mythology offers several striking examples of just how far she was willing to go to defend it. The hunter Actaeon, according to the most famous version of the story, stumbled upon Artemis bathing in a forest spring, an accidental intrusion rather than a deliberate act of disrespect. Artemis, however, showed no mercy for the accident. She transformed him into a stag on the spot, and his own hunting dogs, unable to recognize their master in his new form, tore him apart. It's a brutal punishment for what was, by most accounts, an innocent mistake, but it reinforced something essential about Artemis, that her boundaries were absolute and crossing them, intentionally or not, carried consequences. Despite this fierce, occasionally frightening reputation, Artemis was deeply beloved by mortals, particularly by young women approaching the transition into adulthood, who often performed rituals in her honor before marriage. She was viewed as a protector of the vulnerable, a guardian of childbirth in certain traditions, and a goddess who punished those who preyed upon the weak far more severely than she ever punished simple misfortune. As the goddess of the moon, she represented a kind of calm, watchful presence in the darkness, guiding travelers, illuminating the night, and standing in quiet contrast to her twin brother's blazing, dramatic sunlight. Artemis remains, even by modern standards, one of the more strikingly independent figures in the entire mythological tradition, a goddess who wanted nothing from anyone, and made absolutely certain that everyone respected that. Now let's turn to her twin brother Apollo, god of the sun, music, poetry, prophecy, healing, and archery, a deity with such an overwhelming range of responsibilities that it's genuinely difficult to summarize him in just a few sentences. If the Olympians had professional resumes, Apollo's would be several pages longer than everyone else's combined. Apollo is often depicted as the golden boy of Olympus, radiant, talented, admired, and yet beneath that shining exterior lay a deeply emotional, occasionally volatile personality that surfaces again and again throughout his mythology. He was credited with driving the sun itself across the sky each day, a duty later poets sometimes attributed instead to the earlier sun titan Helios, but one closely associated with Apollo throughout much of Greek tradition regardless. His musical talent was said to be unmatched among the gods, and he was closely associated with the lyre, an instrument that, interestingly enough, he acquired directly from his mischievous younger half-brother Hermes, in exchange for the stolen cattle we mentioned earlier. Apollo's romantic mythology reads as a long, often tragic list of pursuits that rarely ended well for anyone involved. The story of Daphne is perhaps the most famous. Apollo, struck by an arrow from Eros meant to inspire uncontrollable desire, became consumed with love for the nymph Daphne, who wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. As Apollo pursued her relentlessly, Daphne prayed desperately to her father, a river god, for rescue, and was transformed into a laurel tree at the very last moment, her body rooting into the earth as Apollo reached for her. Rather than accepting this clear and permanent rejection, Apollo declared the laurel tree sacred to him from that moment forward, wearing its leaves as a crown, a strange, uncomfortable way of claiming someone who had made every effort to escape him. Apollo also served as the god of prophecy, and his oracle at Delphi became one of the most important religious sites in the entire ancient Greek world. There, a priestess known as the Pythia, seated above a natural chasm believed to release intoxicating vapors from the earth, delivered cryptic prophecies believed to come directly from Apollo himself. Kings, generals, and ordinary citizens alike traveled great distances to consult the oracle before making major decisions, and its prophecies shaped the course of Greek history in ways historians still study today. Despite his prophetic gifts, or perhaps because of them, Apollo's mythology carries a persistent undertone of grief and loss. He is credited with causing the death of the young Spartan prince Hyacinthus during a discus-throwing accident, and in his sorrow, transformed the dying boy into a flower that still carries his name today. Apollo represents brilliance shadowed by heartbreak, talent intertwined with tragedy, a god capable of extraordinary beauty and creation, who nonetheless seemed forever unable to hold onto the people he loved most. Now let's turn to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, home, and domestic harmony, and quite possibly the single most underappreciated deity in the entire Olympian family, largely because her mythology contains almost none of the drama, scandal, or conflict that defines nearly everyone else we've discussed tonight. Hestia was the eldest child of Cronus and Rhea, meaning she was the very first of her siblings to be swallowed by their father, and according to the order in which Zeus eventually forced Cronus to disgorge his children, the very last to be freed, making her simultaneously the oldest and the youngest of the Olympian generation, depending on how you choose to count it, a small but fascinating quirk of Greek mythological logic. Unlike her siblings, Hestia showed no interest whatsoever in claiming power, status, or romantic attachment. When both Poseidon and Apollo reportedly sought her hand in marriage, Hestia refused them both, asking Zeus instead to allow her to remain forever unmarried, tending the sacred hearth fire of Olympus in peace. Zeus granted her request, and when a seat among the 12 Olympians eventually needed to be given up to accommodate the rising popularity of Dionysus, Hestia voluntarily stepped aside without complaint, choosing quiet continuity over status and recognition. Her presence was felt not through dramatic myths, but through the constant, essential role she played in everyday Greek life. Every household maintained a hearth fire believed to be under her protection, and every public building, including town halls, kept an eternal flame burning in her honor, symbolizing the unity and continuity of the community itself. She represented hospitality, a value the ancient Greeks considered sacred, and it was believed that mistreating a guest under one's roof was, in a very real sense, an offense against Hestia directly. In a family filled with jealousy, temper, and constant upheaval, Hestia stood as a figure of calm, steady stability, holding together the one thing every single myth we've covered tonight ultimately depended on: a home to return to. She reminds us that not every kind of power needs to be loud or dramatic to matter deeply, and that sometimes the quietest, most consistent presence in a story is the one holding everything else together. Now, with the 12 Olympians introduced, let's slow down and spend some real time with one story in particular, the tale of Demeter and Persephone, a myth that reaches far beyond a simple family conflict and touches on grief, transformation, and the very structure of the natural world the ancient Greeks lived within. Persephone, daughter of Demeter and Zeus, spent her early life in the sunlit meadows of the mortal world, surrounded by nymphs, flowers, and the gentle abundance her mother's power provided. She was, by most accounts, cherished and sheltered, a young goddess whose innocence and beauty had not yet been tested by the darker corners of the world around her. One afternoon, while gathering flowers in a wide open field, Persephone noticed an unusually beautiful narcissus blossom growing nearby, one some versions of the myth suggest had been placed there deliberately by Zeus, as part of a secret arrangement with his brother Hades, who had confessed his desire to make Persephone his wife. As Persephone reached for the flower, the earth split open beneath her without warning, and Hades emerged from the depths in his chariot, seizing her and pulling her down into the underworld before she had any chance to cry out for help, or before anyone nearby could intervene. The meadow closed behind them as quickly as it had opened, leaving no trace of what had just occurred, only silence, and a scattering of dropped flowers where Persephone had been standing only moments before. Demeter, sensing something was wrong, began searching desperately for her missing daughter, wandering the earth for 9 days and 9 nights without pausing to eat, drink, or rest, calling out Persephone's name across every corner of the mortal world. On the 10th day, she encountered Hecate, goddess of magic and crossroads, who had heard Persephone's cries but hadn't witnessed the abduction itself. Together they approached Helios, the all-seeing sun god, who confirmed what Demeter had feared, that Hades had taken Persephone down into the underworld, with Zeus's knowledge and consent. Demeter's grief transformed almost immediately into a devastating, world-altering rage. Disguising herself as an elderly mortal woman, she withdrew entirely from Olympus and wandered the earth in mourning, abandoning her divine responsibilities altogether. Crops stopped growing. Fields that had once overflowed with grain turned barren and lifeless. Livestock grew thin and weak from lack of pasture. Famine spread rapidly across the mortal world, and as mortals began to starve and die, the sacrifices and offerings the gods depended on for their own honor and sustenance dwindled along with them. For a time, Demeter found a small measure of comfort in the household of a mortal family, where she cared for their young son, and according to certain versions of the myth, attempted to grant the child immortality by holding him over a sacred fire each night, burning away his mortal nature bit by bit. When the boy's mother discovered this ritual and reacted in horror and fear, Demeter abandoned the attempt entirely, revealing her true divine identity, and instructing the family to build a great temple in her honor before resuming her endless, grief-stricken search. As the famine deepened and mortal suffering intensified, the other gods grew increasingly alarmed. Zeus, who had initially dismissed the severity of Demeter's grief, was eventually forced to intervene, not primarily out of sympathy for his sister, but out of concern that a starving humanity would soon leave the gods themselves without worship, without sacrifice, and without the offerings that sustained their status and power. He sent messenger after messenger to plead with Demeter to relent, but she refused every appeal, declaring that she would not allow the earth to bloom again until her daughter was returned to her. Finally, Zeus dispatched Hermes down into the underworld to negotiate directly with Hades, insisting that Persephone be released back to her mother. Hades, perhaps recognizing that he had no real choice in the matter, agreed to let her go, but not before offering her a handful of pomegranate seeds, a small, seemingly innocent gesture that would carry enormous consequences. Persephone, uncertain of what awaited her, or perhaps not fully understanding the significance of what she was doing, ate several of the seeds before departing. This single act bound her permanently to the underworld, because according to the ancient laws governing that realm, anyone who consumed food while within its boundaries could never fully leave it behind. When Persephone was reunited with her mother on the earth's surface, their joy was immediate and overwhelming, a reunion so powerful it's often described as one of the most emotionally moving scenes in all of Greek mythology. But the celebration was short-lived once Demeter learned about the pomegranate seeds. A compromise was ultimately reached, one designed to satisfy both Demeter's grief and the binding laws of the underworld itself. Persephone would spend a portion of each year, traditionally described as several months, down in the underworld beside Hades as his wife and queen, and the remainder of the year above ground with her mother. During the months Persephone spends below, Demeter's grief returns in full force, and she withdraws her blessing from the earth once again, causing the cold, barren months of autumn and winter. When Persephone ascends once more into the sunlight, Demeter's joy restores the world to life, bringing the blooming abundance of spring and the fruitful warmth of summer. What makes this myth so enduring isn't simply its explanation for the changing seasons, though that alone made it central to ancient Greek understanding of the natural world. It's the way the story quietly transforms over its own telling. Persephone, who begins the myth as an innocent, sheltered young goddess pulled into darkness against her will, gradually becomes something far more complex by its end, a queen of the underworld in her own right, ruling alongside Hades with a growing sense of authority and calm command that stands in stark contrast to the frightened girl who was first dragged beneath the earth. Later traditions even describe mortals praying directly to Persephone for mercy, for safe passage into the afterlife, treating her not merely as Hades' wife, but as a powerful figure in her own right, someone who understood loss, transformation, and the delicate balance between two very different worlds better than almost any other deity in the entire pantheon. The myth of Demeter and Persephone became the foundation for the Eleusinian mysteries we touched on earlier, one of the most significant religious traditions in the ancient Greek world, offering initiates a promise of comfort and hope regarding what awaited them after death, built entirely around the idea that even the deepest, most devastating loss can eventually give way to renewal, that darkness and light exist in necessary balance with one another, each defining the meaning of the other through their constant cyclical exchange. Let's rest here again for just a little while. Feel free to let your eyes stay closed if they already are. There's still more ahead tonight, the story of Cupid and Psyche, a tale of doubt, trial, and love tested nearly to its breaking point, and afterward the story of Medusa, one of the most misunderstood figures in the entirety of Greek mythology. Take your time. There's no rush at all tonight. Let's move now into one of the most beloved love stories to survive from the ancient world, the tale of Cupid and Psyche, a myth that unfolds less like a typical adventure of gods and monsters, and more like a long, aching fairy tale about trust, doubt, and the strange lengths love will go to in order to survive. There was once a king who had 3 daughters, and the youngest of them, named Psyche, possessed a beauty so extraordinary that word of her began to spread far beyond her father's kingdom. People started traveling from distant towns and cities simply to catch a glimpse of her, and in time, some began to whisper that she was more beautiful than Aphrodite herself, the very goddess of beauty and desire. Crowds gathered outside her home. Strangers left offerings at her feet as though she were divine. And slowly, quietly, the great temples built in Aphrodite's honor began to grow empty, as mortals turned their devotion toward this mortal girl instead. For Psyche herself, none of this brought happiness. Her 2 older sisters had already married and settled into ordinary, contented lives, but no suitor dared approach Psyche, terrified of the idea of competing with a woman rumored to rival the gods themselves in beauty. She was worshipped from a distance, admired from afar, and yet entirely untouched by the one thing she quietly longed for most, genuine love, someone who saw her as a person rather than a spectacle to be marveled at. She spent her days wandering her father's gardens in a strange kind of isolation, beautiful beyond comparison, and yet more alone than either of her sisters had ever been. Word of the mortal girl being compared to Aphrodite eventually reached the goddess herself, and Aphrodite did not take the comparison well. Her sacred temple stood empty while a mortal received garlands and prayers meant for a goddess, and to Aphrodite, this wasn't simply an inconvenience, it was a direct insult to her divine status. Consumed with jealousy, she summoned her son Eros, the winged god of desire and longing, known to the Romans as Cupid, and gave him a very specific instruction. He was to use one of his enchanted arrows to make Psyche fall desperately in love with the most repulsive, wretched creature he could find, ensuring that her beauty would bring her nothing but humiliation and misery for the rest of her days. Eros, ever obedient to his mother, descended to the mortal world under cover of darkness to carry out her command. He found Psyche asleep in her chamber, and as he leaned in close with his arrow ready, he made the mistake of looking directly at her face. In that single, unplanned moment, his hand slipped, and the tip of his own arrow grazed his skin. It was only the smallest wound, barely more than a scratch, but the magic of his arrows worked on gods just as powerfully as it worked on mortals, and Eros found himself instantly, hopelessly in love with the very woman he had been sent to curse. Shaken and unsure of what to do next, Eros left without carrying out his mother's instructions, and from that night forward, he found himself torn between loyalty to Aphrodite and an entirely new, overwhelming devotion to Psyche. a devotion he knew he would have to keep hidden if he hoped to protect either of them from his mother's wrath. Meanwhile, back in the mortal world, Psyche's situation continued to worsen. Despite her beauty, no suitor ever came forward to ask for her hand, and her father, growing increasingly anxious about her future, eventually consulted the oracle of Apollo for guidance. The answer he received was unlike anything he had hoped for. The oracle declared that Psyche was destined not to marry a mortal man at all, but instead to become the bride of a fearsome creature, a beast so terrible that even the gods themselves were said to tremble before it. She was to be dressed in funeral garments rather than wedding robes, led to the peak of a nearby mountain, and left there alone to await her monstrous husband. Her family was devastated. Her sisters wept. Her father could barely bring himself to carry out the oracle's instructions, and the entire kingdom mourned as though preparing for a funeral rather than a wedding. And yet Psyche herself, faced with a fate she couldn't escape, accepted it with a strange, quiet resolve. Perhaps, she thought, this was simply the price of the beauty that had brought her nothing but isolation. If the gods had decided this was her destiny, then she would meet it without further resistance. She was led up the mountain exactly as the oracle demanded, left alone beneath the open sky as the procession that had accompanied her turned and made its way back down, their torches fading into the distance until Psyche was left entirely by herself, waiting for whatever monstrous fate awaited her. But instead of claws or fangs or fire, a gentle wind rose up around her, lifting her carefully off the mountainside and carrying her softly downward through the air until she was set down, unharmed and trembling, in the middle of a hidden valley she had never seen before. Before her stood a palace unlike anything built by mortal hands, its pillars gleaming, its halls filled with a soft, golden light that seemed to come from nowhere in particular. As she stepped hesitantly through its entrance, unseen hands attended to her, guiding her through warm baths, dressing her in fine robes and setting a magnificent feast before her, though she could see no servants preparing any of it. Disembodied voices spoke gently to her, reassuring her, welcoming her, urging her to rest and feel at ease in her new surroundings. When night fell, a voice spoke to her in the darkness of her bedchamber, deep, warm, and unmistakably kind. It told her not to be afraid, that this palace was now her home, and that he, her unseen husband, the very creature the oracle had promised her, meant her no harm whatsoever. Psyche, though understandably uncertain, found herself surprisingly at ease in his presence, and as the days turned into weeks, she grew steadily closer to this mysterious husband who visited her only under cover of darkness, and disappeared again before the first light of morning ever touched the sky. He asked only one thing of her in return for the comfort and safety he provided, that she never attempt to look upon his face, never bring a light into their chamber at night, never try to uncover the truth of who, or what, he truly was. Psyche agreed, and for a time she found something close to genuine happiness in her strange new life, comforted by a voice she had come to love deeply, even without ever having seen the face behind it. But happiness built entirely on mystery rarely stays settled for long, and Psyche began to grow restless, missing her family and increasingly curious about the identity of the husband she had never once laid eyes on. Eventually, she asked him if her two sisters might be allowed to visit her. Hoping to ease the isolation that still lingered beneath her otherwise comfortable new life. Her husband, sensing danger in the request, warned her that her sisters would try to poison her trust in him, that whatever they said, she must not allow doubt to take root in her heart. But he could never bring himself to deny her anything she truly wanted, and so, reluctantly, he agreed to let them visit. When Psyche's sisters arrived at the hidden palace, carried there by the same gentle wind that had once carried Psyche herself, they were stunned by the luxury surrounding her, the fine robes, the invisible servants, the endless golden halls that put even their own comfortable married lives to shame. Beneath their embraces and their careful words of joy at seeing her again, jealousy began to stir, quiet and corrosive, and when they asked about her husband and learned that she had never once seen his face, that jealousy quickly transformed into something far more dangerous. They began planting seeds of fear and suspicion in Psyche's mind, suggesting that a husband who refused to be seen must surely be hiding something monstrous, that perhaps the oracle's original warning had been correct after all, and that Psyche was living not with a loving companion, but with the very beast she had been promised to. They urged her to take a lamp into their bedchamber one night while he slept, to finally uncover the truth for herself, insisting that if he truly loved her, the light would reveal nothing to fear. Psyche, torn between the peace she had built with her unseen husband and the doubt her sisters had so carefully cultivated, found herself unable to silence the fear now growing inside her. That night, once her husband had fallen asleep beside her, she rose quietly from their bed, lit a small oil lamp, and, hands trembling, brought it close enough to finally see his face for the first time. What she found waiting in the golden light was not a monster at all. It was Eros himself, the god of love, his features soft and beautiful in sleep, his wings folded gently against his back. Overcome with relief, guilt, and a rush of tenderness all at once, Psyche leaned in closer to look at him, and in doing so, allowed a single drop of hot oil to fall from her lamp onto his bare shoulder. Eros woke instantly, in pain and in heartbreak, realizing immediately what had happened, that despite every warning, Psyche had broken the one promise he had ever asked of her. Without another word, he rose and flew away from her, the palace around them beginning to dissolve as he left, until Psyche found herself alone once again on a barren hillside, the golden world she had known vanishing as though it had never existed at all. She had gained the truth she so desperately sought, and in doing so, had lost the very thing that mattered most to her. Devastated, Psyche wandered the earth in search of Eros, calling his name across forests and fields, receiving no answer from the god who had once whispered so gently to her in the darkness. Word soon reached her that this entire ordeal had been set into motion by Aphrodite herself, and rather than continuing to search blindly, Psyche made the difficult decision to approach the goddess directly, hoping that by facing her, she might find a path back to the man she loved. Aphrodite, still furious that her son had defied her wishes and fallen in love with the very mortal she had intended to punish, showed Psyche no immediate mercy. Instead, she declared that if Psyche truly wished to prove herself worthy of Eros's love, she would first need to complete a series of impossible trials, tasks designed not merely to test her, but to break her entirely. The first task seemed simple on its surface, but was designed to be nearly impossible in practice. Aphrodite led Psyche to an enormous storeroom filled with a chaotic mixture of grains and seeds, wheat, barley, lentils, poppy seeds, and beans, all tangled together in a single overwhelming pile, and instructed her to sort every single seed into its own separate container before nightfall, warning that failure would cost her any hope of seeing Eros again. Psyche stared at the impossible task before her, knowing that even working without rest for the entire day, she could never sort such an enormous quantity of seeds through human hands alone. And yet, as she knelt down and began working regardless, help arrived from an unexpected source. A colony of ants, moved either by pity for her situation or by the quiet influence of unseen gods sympathetic to her plight, descended upon the pile and began sorting the seeds with astonishing speed and precision, dividing grain from grain until the entire chaotic mess had been transformed into neat, orderly piles well before the sun went down. When Aphrodite returned that evening expecting failure, she found the task completed flawlessly instead, and though furious that Psyche had somehow succeeded, she refused to relent, immediately assigning her a second, even more dangerous trial. This time, Aphrodite directed Psyche toward a distant field, where a flock of golden-fleeced rams grazed beneath the open sky, rams known throughout the region for their violent temperament and razor-sharp horns, creatures that had gored and killed anyone foolish enough to approach them directly. Psyche was instructed to gather a handful of their prized golden wool and return it by the end of the day. As Psyche approached the field, terrified by the sight of the rams charging and colliding with one another in the harsh light of midday, she nearly gave up entirely, overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion. But once again, help arrived quietly, this time in the whispered advice of a nearby river spirit, who warned her against approaching the dangerous rams while the sun was still high, explaining that their aggression softened considerably once evening fell and they retreated into the shade to rest. The spirit suggested she wait until dusk, and then simply gather the loose tufts of golden wool that clung naturally to the thorny bushes surrounding the field, wool the rams themselves had shed without ever needing to be approached directly at all. Psyche followed this advice exactly, waiting patiently through the dangerous hours of daylight, and once the rams had settled peacefully into the shadows, she moved quietly among the thorn bushes, collecting enough golden wool to satisfy Aphrodite's demand without ever placing herself in the ram's direct path. When she returned with the shimmering wool in hand, Aphrodite's fury only deepened, suspecting, correctly, that Psyche had received outside help once again, though she could prove nothing. Undeterred and growing increasingly desperate to see Psyche fail, Aphrodite assigned a third task, one specifically designed with almost no reasonable chance of survival. She instructed Psyche to travel to a distant, treacherous cliff, where the black waters of the river Styx, the very river marking the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, cascaded down through jagged rocks guarded by fearsome serpents and treacherous currents that no mortal had ever successfully navigated. Psyche was to fill a small crystal vial with the river's sacred water and bring it back untouched. Standing at the edge of the terrifying cliff, staring down at the swirling black water far below, guarded by creatures that would tear apart anyone who dared approach, Psyche understood immediately that this task, unlike the previous two, offered no clear path to survival through simple patience or clever timing. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her entirely, an eagle, sent by Zeus himself, swept down from the sky, took the crystal vial gently from her trembling hands, and navigated the deadly currents and guardian serpents with an ease no mortal or lesser creature could ever hope to match, returning moments later with the vial filled precisely as Aphrodite had demanded. When Psyche presented the completed task to Aphrodite, the goddess accepted it in stony, resentful silence, unable to deny that Psyche had somehow overcome yet another impossible challenge. And so, with a coldness sharper than anything before, Aphrodite issued her fourth and final task, one she fully expected would finally destroy the mortal girl who had caused her so much frustration. Psyche was to travel down into the underworld itself, to the throne of Persephone, and request a small box containing a portion of Persephone's own beauty, which Aphrodite claimed she needed to restore her own radiance after the exhausting ordeal of dealing with Psyche's endless trials. It was, in every practical sense, a death sentence, since living mortals were never meant to enter the realm of the dead and return. Rather than despairing, Psyche accepted even this seemingly impossible task, with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through everything else. Guided by whispered instructions, some versions of the myth suggest from a mysterious tower she encountered along her journey, she prepared carefully for her descent, bringing 2 coins to pay Charon, the ferryman of the dead, for safe passage across the river separating the living from the underworld, and honeyed barley cakes to pacify Cerberus, the 3-headed hound guarding the entrance to Hades' realm. Following each piece of guidance precisely, Psyche successfully crossed into the underworld, calmed Cerberus with the offered cakes, and eventually found her way to Persephone's throne, where she humbly explained her situation and made her request. Persephone, moved either by sympathy or by a quiet understanding of what it meant to be caught between 2 powerful forces beyond one's control, agreed to fill the box as requested, warning Psyche only that she must not open it under any circumstances before delivering it directly to Aphrodite. Psyche began her journey back toward the surface, carrying the sealed box carefully, and for a long while, she resisted the growing temptation to look inside. But as she drew closer to the world of the living, doubt crept in once again, the same kind of doubt that had already cost her so dearly once before. She began to wonder whether using even a small portion of the beauty inside the box for herself might help repair whatever damage her ordeal had caused to her own appearance, and whether doing so might make her more worthy of Eros's love when, and if, she ever saw him again. Unable to resist the temptation any longer, Psyche opened the box, expecting to find some trace of divine beauty waiting inside. Instead, what escaped from the box was not beauty at all, but a deep, deathly sleep, a magical slumber crafted specifically to remain within the underworld, one that overtook Psyche instantly and completely, leaving her collapsed and unmoving on the ground, caught in an endless, dreamless rest, neither alive nor dead, simply suspended. It was there, in that motionless, silent state, that Eros finally found her. Having recovered from his injury and unable to stop thinking of the woman he had left behind, he had been secretly following the news of her impossible trials from a distance, watching her endure suffering after suffering for his sake, without ever revealing himself or intervening directly, held back by fear of his mother's continued wrath. But seeing her now, fallen and lifeless at the edge of the underworld, he could hold himself back no longer. Eros gently gathered the magical sleep back into its box, sealing it away safely, and leaned down to wake Psyche the only way he knew how, with a single gentle kiss. Psyche stirred, her eyes opening slowly, and the moment she recognized him, all the pain, doubt, and fear of the past months seemed to dissolve at once into overwhelming relief and joy. Together, Eros and Psyche made their way to Olympus, where Eros pleaded directly with Zeus to allow their love to continue without further interference from Aphrodite. Zeus, moved by the sheer devotion Psyche had shown throughout her trials, and perhaps eager to finally settle the matter once and for all, agreed to intervene personally. He summoned Psyche before the assembled gods and offered her a goblet of ambrosia, the sacred drink of immortality, transforming her from a mortal woman into a goddess in her own right, finally making her a fitting, equal partner for Eros in every sense that mattered to the gods. Aphrodite, faced with her son's unwavering devotion and Zeus's direct decision, ultimately relented, accepting the marriage rather than continuing a battle she could no longer realistically win. Eros and Psyche were married properly before all of Olympus, and in time, their union produced a daughter named Hedon, whose name means pleasure or delight, a fitting symbol born from a love that had survived doubt, jealousy, impossible trials, and even death itself. The myth of Cupid and Psyche endures because, unlike so many of the darker, more chaotic stories we've covered tonight, it offers something closer to genuine resolution, a love tested repeatedly by fear and doubt, but ultimately strong enough to survive every single obstacle placed in its path. Psyche's very name, meaning soul in ancient Greek, reflects the deeper meaning later scholars found within her story, a journey representing the soul's own long, difficult passage through suffering and uncertainty toward eventual wholeness and peace. Let's rest here again for just a little while before we move into our final story of the night. Feel your breathing slow. Feel the weight of the evening settling comfortably around you. What remains ahead is the story of Medusa and of the hero Perseus, a tale far more complicated and in many ways far more tragic than the myths most people think they already know. Let's move now into our final story of the night, one of the most misunderstood tales in the entire Greek mythological tradition, the story of Medusa and the hero who would eventually become famous for defeating her, Perseus. It's a story that, on the surface, reads like a simple monster-slaying adventure, but underneath, it carries a far more complicated, far more human weight than most retellings ever allow it to have. Long before she became known as a monster capable of turning men to stone with a single glance, Medusa was a mortal woman, and by most accounts, an extraordinarily beautiful one. She was born into a family of primordial sea deities, her parents ancient beings associated with the deep, older even than many of the Olympians we've already discussed tonight. Her two sisters, Athena and Uriel, were immortal from birth, monstrous in appearance and temperament, embodying a kind of raw, fearsome power. Medusa, however, was different from the moment she was born, mortal, capable of death in a way her sisters were not, and remarkable for a beauty that stood in sharp contrast to the rest of her monstrous lineage. As a young woman, Medusa chose to dedicate herself to the service of Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, entering into her temple as one of her devoted priestesses. This was no small commitment. Priestesses of Athena were expected to maintain strict vows of chastity and devotion, living a life set apart from ordinary romantic or domestic pursuits in favor of complete dedication to the goddess they served. Medusa embraced this life fully, tending to Athena's temple, maintaining its sacred rituals, and living, by most accounts, a quiet, disciplined existence entirely removed from the chaos and scandal that defined so many other figures throughout Greek mythology. Her beauty, however, proved impossible to fully contain within the walls of a temple. Word of her striking appearance spread well beyond the community she served, and travelers reportedly went out of their way simply to catch a glimpse of the young priestess, said to rival even the goddess she served in loveliness. This growing reputation eventually reached the attention of Poseidon, god of the sea, whose interest in mortal women we've already touched on earlier tonight through his numerous other entanglements throughout Greek myth. According to the most commonly told version of this myth, Poseidon became fixated on Medusa specifically because of her devotion and untouchable status, drawn not simply to her beauty, but to the very fact that she belonged to no one, that she had placed herself entirely beyond the reach of romantic or physical pursuit through her sacred vows. One version of the story suggests this obsession eventually led Poseidon to enter Athena's own temple, violating both the sacred space and Medusa herself, in an act of assault that took place directly beneath the gaze of Athena's own statue. When Athena discovered what had occurred within her sacred temple, her response was one of the more troubling and widely debated episodes in the entire mythological tradition. Rather than directing her anger toward Poseidon, a fellow Olympian whose power and standing made him difficult to challenge directly, Athena's fury fell instead upon Medusa, the mortal priestess who had suffered the violation. Some ancient sources frame this as Athena viewing the sanctity of her temple as having been irreparably desecrated, regardless of consent or circumstance, while others frame it as a kind of divine jealousy, unable to tolerate the idea that her once beautiful priestess had somehow drawn Poseidon's attention in the first place. Whatever the underlying reasoning, Athena's punishment was swift, permanent, and transformative in the most literal sense. She cursed Medusa, turning her once celebrated beauty into something monstrous and terrifying instead. Her flowing hair was transformed into a writhing mass of venomous serpents, hissing and twisting continuously atop her head. Her once gentle eyes became a weapon in their own right, capable of turning any living creature that met her direct gaze instantly into solid stone. It was a punishment that stripped away not just her appearance, but her entire ability to exist peacefully among others ever again, since even the most innocent, accidental glance from another living being would now end in tragedy. Banished from Athena's temple and unable to return to any kind of normal life among mortals or gods, Medusa fled into exile, eventually settling on a remote, desolate island far from any city or settlement, a place where she could exist without constantly risking the accidental destruction of anyone who happened to cross her path. Over time, her exile became populated by an increasingly grim collection of visitors, adventurers, warriors, and self-proclaimed heroes who arrived hopping to claim glory by slaying the monster they had heard whispered about in increasingly exaggerated tales. None of them ever returned. Instead, their forms remained scattered across the island, frozen forever in stone at the exact moment they had first laid eyes on her, their faces locked in expressions of shock, fear, or occasionally something closer to sorrow. An ever-growing garden of statues marking Medusa's isolated, cursed existence. While Medusa lived out her exile in solitude, an entirely different story was unfolding on the mainland, one that would eventually bring her into direct and fatal contact with a young hero named Perseus. Perseus was the son of Zeus and a mortal princess named Danae, whose own father, King Acrisius, had received a troubling prophecy warning that he would one day be killed by his own grandson. Determined to prevent this fate from ever coming true, Acrisius locked his daughter away in an underground bronze chamber, isolated from any possible suitor who might father the child the prophecy warned him about. Zeus, however, has never been particularly deterred by locked doors throughout any of the mythology we've covered tonight, and he found his way into Danae's chamber in the form of a shower of golden light, resulting in the birth of Perseus despite every precaution her father had taken. When Acrisius discovered the child's existence, rather than risking direct violence against a child fathered by Zeus himself, he chose a slower, more cowardly method of execution, sealing both mother and infant into a wooden chest and casting them out to sea, leaving their fate in the hands of the ocean rather than his own. The chest drifted for a considerable distance before eventually washing ashore on the island of Seriphos, where a kind-hearted fisherman discovered them and took them in, raising Perseus alongside his mother in relative safety and anonymity for many years. Perseus grew into a strong, capable young man, entirely unaware of the divine parentage that had shaped the strange circumstances of his birth, until the ruler of the island, a man named Poseidon, began pursuing Danae romantically, an interest she had no desire to reciprocate. Perseus, now old enough to serve as his mother's protector, stood firmly between Poseidon and his unwanted advances, frustrating the king's plans and earning his quiet resentment in the process. Rather than confronting Perseus directly, Poseidon devised a clever scheme to remove him from the picture entirely. He announced a grand feast, requiring every guest to bring an appropriately impressive gift, fully expecting that Perseus, being of humble means, would be unable to contribute anything of real value, providing the king with a convenient excuse to publicly humiliate him. When pressed about what gift he intended to bring, Perseus, driven by pride and perhaps not yet fully considering the reality of what he was proposing, boldly declared that he would bring the king the head of Medusa herself, a monster so feared that even the suggestion of hunting her was considered a virtual death sentence. Poseidon, delighted at having trapped the young man into such an impossible boast, held him to his word immediately, sending him off on what everyone assumed would be a one-way journey. Fortunately for Perseus, his divine heritage meant he wasn't entirely without allies among the gods. Athena, whose own complicated history with Medusa we've already discussed, took a particular interest in guiding the young hero toward his seemingly impossible task, perhaps viewing his quest as a strange, roundabout way of settling unfinished business connected to her earlier curse. Hermes, ever helpful to mortals navigating dangerous circumstances, joined her in offering assistance and guidance. Together, the two gods equipped Perseus with an extraordinary collection of magical tools essential to his survival. Hermes provided a pair of winged sandals, granting him the ability to fly swiftly across great distances. Athena provided a polished bronze shield, reflective enough to serve as a mirror, along with careful instructions on how it needed to be used. Hades, in a rare moment of direct involvement in the affairs of the living, contributed a helm capable of rendering its wearer completely invisible, and Hermes further supplied an unusually sharp, curved blade, specifically enchanted to be capable of cutting through Medusa's otherwise impenetrable, serpent-covered form. Before Perseus could even attempt to locate Medusa's remote island, however, he first needed to discover exactly where it was hidden, information known only to a group of ancient beings called the Gree, three sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth between them, passing each back and forth whenever one of them needed to see or eat. Perseus tracked down these strange, ancient sisters and, in a clever, if slightly ruthless move, intercepted the eye as it was being passed between them, refusing to return it until they revealed the location of Medusa's island. Left with no other choice, the sisters relented, providing him with the directions he needed to continue his quest. Armed with his divine tools and his newfound knowledge of Medusa's location, Perseus flew across the sea toward the remote, desolate island where she lived in permanent exile. As he approached, he passed over field after field of stone statues, silent testimony to every previous hero who had attempted this same task and failed catastrophically. It was a landscape built entirely from the consequences of overconfidence, a warning that Perseus, wisely, chose to take seriously rather than dismiss. Remembering Athena's careful instructions never to look directly at Medusa, Perseus approached her resting place using only the reflection in his polished shield to guide his movements, watching her image mirrored safely rather than risking direct eye contact. He found her asleep among her equally monstrous, though immortal, sisters, her serpents coiled quietly around her as she rested. Moving carefully and silently, guided entirely by the reflected image in his shield, Perseus approached close enough to strike, and in a single, swift motion, severed her head from her body using the enchanted blade Hermes had provided. The moment of her death produced an unexpected and startling result. From the wound left behind emerged two beings that had apparently been growing within her all along, the winged horse Pegasus and a warrior named Chrysaor, both said to be the offspring of her earlier encounter with Poseidon, a final, strange echo of the very violation that had led to her transformation and exile in the first place. It's a detail many later retellings quietly leave out, but one that adds an additional layer of tragedy to her story, suggesting that even in death, the consequences of what had been done to her continued to unfold in ways she never had any control over. Perseus quickly placed Medusa's severed head into a specially prepared satchel, careful never to look directly at it, aware that even in death, her gaze retained its petrifying power. As he made his way back across the sea toward Seriphos, he found himself facing a new series of dangers, drawing the attention of Medusa's surviving immortal sisters, who pursued him briefly before he managed to escape using the invisibility granted by Hades's helm. During his return journey, Perseus is said to have passed over the kingdom of Ethiopia, where he encountered a princess named Andromeda, chained to a rocky cliff, as a sacrifice intended to appease a sea monster sent by Poseidon, after her mother had made the foolish mistake of boasting that her daughter's beauty surpassed that of the sea nymphs themselves. Perseus, using both his sword and, according to some versions, even Medusa's severed head itself, managed to defeat the monster and rescue Andromeda, later marrying her, and adding yet another chapter to what had already become an extraordinarily eventful journey. Eventually, Perseus returned to Seriphos, where Polydex, never expecting the young man to survive his impossible quest, was stunned to see him arrive triumphant. Rather than accepting defeat gracefully, the king mocked Perseus in front of his gathered court, refusing to believe he had truly accomplished what he claimed. In response, Perseus revealed Medusa's severed head, and Polydex, along with several members of his court who happened to be looking directly at that moment, were instantly turned to stone, a fitting, almost poetic end for a man whose cruelty and manipulation had set the entire quest into motion in the first place. With Polydex gone, Perseus placed the kind fisherman who had originally rescued him and his mother onto the throne of Seriphos instead, ensuring that the man who had shown them genuine kindness during their years of vulnerability was properly rewarded. Perseus then returned Medusa's head to Athena, as the goddess had originally requested, and she affixed it permanently to the center of her own shield, known as the Aegis. Transforming what had once been a symbol of tragedy and violation into a powerful defensive weapon, that would accompany her into battle for the remainder of her mythology. There's a strange, uncomfortable irony worth sitting with in this final detail. The very goddess responsible for Medusa's original curse ultimately became the permanent keeper of her severed head, carrying her image forward eternally, both as a trophy of Perseus's heroism and as a lasting symbol of Athena's own power. For centuries afterward, the image of Medusa's face, twisted in serpents and frozen in her final expression, appeared on shields, temples, and artwork throughout the ancient Greek world, used specifically for its power to ward off evil and protect against harm, a concept later scholars would come to call the apotropaic use of her image. For a very long time, popular retellings of this myth focused almost entirely on Perseus, framing him as the clear hero of the story, and Medusa simply as the monstrous obstacle standing between him and glory. But a closer, more careful reading of her mythology reveals something considerably more complicated underneath that simple framing. A woman who began her story as a devoted, virtuous priestess, who suffered a violation she never asked for, who was punished by the very goddess she had faithfully served rather than by the god actually responsible for what had happened to her, and who spent the remainder of her existence isolated, feared, and eventually hunted down for a curse she never chose for herself in the first place. In more recent centuries, scholars, artists, and storytellers have increasingly returned to Medusa's story with exactly this more complicated lens, recognizing her not simply as a monster to be defeated, but as one of mythology's clearest examples of a victim who was transformed into something to be feared, rather than someone deserving of protection or sympathy. Her story raises uncomfortable questions that remain relevant even now. Questions about who gets blamed when harm occurs, about the difference between punishment and justice, and about how easily a person's identity can be rewritten entirely by those with more power than they have. And yet, despite everything that was taken from her, despite the curse, the exile, and the violent end forced upon her by a young hero simply trying to prove himself worthy of a king's approval, Medusa's image has endured for thousands of years, appearing again and again throughout art, literature, and popular culture, a face that continues to provoke fear in some, and quiet sympathy in others, depending entirely on which version of her long, complicated story happens to be the one being told. That brings us to the end of tonight's journey through the tangled, dramatic, endlessly fascinating world of Greek mythology. We've spent the evening together with gods who ruled the sky, the sea, and the depths of the underworld, with a mother's grief powerful enough to reshape the very seasons, with a love strong enough to survive impossible trials and even death itself, and with a woman whose story reminds us that the line between monster and victim has always been far blurrier than the old stories were originally willing to admit. If you're still awake at this point, thank you for staying with us this long, though truthfully, our hope is that you drifted off somewhere along the way, carried gently into sleep by these old, strange, deeply human stories that have survived for thousands of years precisely because they still have something to say to us, even now. Rest well tonight. We'll be here again next time with more quiet, unhurried stories to carry you gently into sleep.